In this video I'm going to be making a little step stool for Ria. She reminded me recently that she wanted one.
Make me a little footstool.
Yeah, that's on my to-do list, actually. For this build I'm going to be using a really nice and very old solid mahogany wardrobe panel. I originally had two of these which were given to me by a work colleague. The first I used to make a mahogany and brass box for my brother and his fiance's wedding gift, which is another video on my channel. I wanted to make the stool to fit under this shelf in my dining room, which has become a bit of a dumping ground for things that should really be in the workshop. So I began by taking some measurements and then I could design what I wanted to make in SketchUp. The plans and a cut list for this project will be available via my Patreon page for anyone who wants to make one. And the mahogany panel that I'm using is about 19mm thick, so a good substitute would be something like an 18mm plywood. First I cut a clean and straight edge along the length of the panel using my circular saw with a straight edge clamp down to guide the cut. Then I could reference that freshly cut straight edge against the fence of my panel cutting jig at the table saw so that I could make a clean 90-degree cross cut. I measured and marked up to cut what would be the length for the top panel of the stool, and then I ripped it to width. I could then use the rest of the workpiece to rip some pieces that I could use to make the legs. I wanted the legs to be angled, so I set the mitre saw to 15 degrees based on the angle used on my drawing and cut that angle onto one end of each of the leg pieces. I used a small square to reference 90 degrees from that 15-degree cut, and then I marked up for the length I wanted the legs to be. I set my bevel gauge to the 15-degree angle and then I could mark up a cut line for the bottom of the legs. I could then line up the blade and make the cuts. The two legs on each side of the stool would be joined together, so I marked up where I wanted to remove some material to form the joint. And I made those cuts at the bandsaw. Then I could position the two legs flush with one another and I popped them in the vise to clean up those bandsaw cuts with a block plane. And then I could check that I had planed square. The legs went together really nicely, but before gluing them up I wanted to also cut a taper to the legs. So I made a mark where I wanted the bottom of the taper to end, and then I used my tapering jig to cut away from the inside of each leg. Now I had the top and legs cut, there'd be one more component I'd need for the stool, and that was a centre support rail which will tie both leg panels together and support the top. I measured up how long I wanted that to be and then ripped two pieces at the table saw before cutting to length at the mitre saw, and then I laminated them together as I wanted the support rail to be nice and thick. Once the glue was dry I could clean up the edges. And then I marked up a shape for the underside of the rail just to give it some shape, and I cut that out at the bandsaw. This mahogany had some old varnish on one side and quite a few knocks and dings and scrapes, so I ran both sides of all of the pieces through the thickness planer to clean them up and get all of the pieces to a consistent thickness. When I ripped the top panels to width earlier, I'd already sized them so that they would just fit through the width of my planer, with just a couple of millimeters clearance either side. Then I could start assembling. I first glued the legs together and I added some masking tape to the sides to add a bit of traction for the glue ups. And then I could use the offcuts from cutting the angles earlier to help clamp them up. Using masking tape here seemed to work well at the time to stop the angled blocks slipping out of place under the pressure of the clamps, but I later found that the clamps were loose, so obviously some slipping had occurred,
but by that point the glue had set and the legs were good and solid anyway, so fortunately the joints were fine. Next time I do this though, I'll probably hot glue the clamping blocks onto the masking tape to help stop them moving around. I used a card scraper to clean up the surface of the top panel because my thickness planer hadn't left a great surface due to my blades being old and dull. I've been meaning to replace the blades for a while now and I've already got the new blades, but it's just a job that I've been putting off. I decided to add rounded corners to soften the look of the tops a bit, which I cut on the bandsaw before refining the shape of each corner using my disc sander. I also added a roundover to the top edges of the top panel using my router. This left a few burn marks because all of my router bits are cheap and not very good quality, but I could clean them up later by sanding. To make the leg structure of the stool nice and strong, I wanted to cut some housing joints in the legs to accept the centre rail. That would create some side grain to side grain gluing surface to make the joints nice and strong. For that I decided to make a simple jig using a scrap piece of plywood. I first marked up a 90-degree line roughly in the centre, and then I offered up the glue line of the centre rail to that line, and I marked around the workpiece with a pencil. I cut out that shape at the bandsaw, and here you can see that the centre rail now fits nice and snugly inside it. So this piece of plywood would be a template to cut the housing joints into the legs, so I could then clamp it in place onto the legs and use a template bit in my router to cut the joint. As you can see, the bearing on the router bit is riding along the plywood template. After making one pass, I lowered the bit in the router and made a second pass to get the joint to the depth I wanted, which was roughly half the thickness of the leg panels. I used a chisel just to square up the corners of the joints, and then the centre rail slotted nicely in place while I did a dry assembly just to make sure that everything would fit together okay. I could then add glue, I made sure that the centre rail was seated nicely in the joints with my mallet, and I clamped it all up. While I had good access, I decided to add my maker's mark to the centre rail too. Then I could add glue to the top and position the top panel in place, and you'll see here that I didn't apply any glue to the top of the legs, and that's because I just wanted to secure it to the centre rail so that the top panel will be able to expand and contract with seasonal movement. That should help prevent the top panel from cracking over time. After making sure that the top was centred, I added some weight and left it to dry. I did some hand sanding to ease over the bottom of the legs. This will help to prevent grain tear out when the stool gets moved around the floor.
People ask me why I like cordless power tools over corded power tools, and this is why.
And then I used my random orbit sander with 120 grit to sand the flat surfaces, and also to remove the burn marks left by the router bit. Before applying a finish, I first blew away any dust using my air blower, and then I applied some spray varnish. After about 20 minutes, when the first coat was dry, I sprayed on a little water and sanded at 400 grit to denib the finish and get it nice and smooth. And then I wiped away any dust and added a second coat. And once that was dry, I wet sanded once more and applied a third coat, and I decided to stop there. So here's the stool in action. And I thought I'd do a quick jump test too.
That's the step stool done. I'm pretty pleased with how it turned out. If I were to make it again though, I'd probably change the shape of the support rail underneath. I think it'd look better with more of a subtle curve, but it doesn't matter too much because you're never really going to see that anyway as it's underneath. Other than that, I like the design and it functions really well, and the size is great for what we needed. It tucks under the shelf nicely. I actually made 2 of these step stools out of the material I had to work with, and the other one is available for sale via my Etsy store, and there's a link to that in the description box below. The project took about 6 hours to build and finish, and that's for 2 of the stools, and that excludes the time it took to design in SketchUp. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already for more weekly woodworking videos, and thank you for watching.